So you've probably seen countless videos talking about the mighty English warbow. And fairly recently we talked about the possible reasons why the short recurve bow, as used extensively by the Ottoman Turks, wasn't more widely adopted in Europe. But of course not all recurve bows are built the same. Some of them are much bigger. And here we're going to look at why there was such a big difference between some recurve bows and others, and what that might possibly tell us about the role of the English warbow. Hi mates, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So first up, there is a great variety of recurve composite bows throughout history, and they've been used for absolutely hundreds of years. In their modern forms, you're probably most familiar with the Turkish style bows, which were more or less copied, for example, in India by the Mughals. However, you might also be familiar with the various forms of Manchu and Chinese, or indeed Mongolian recurve bows. And these are, although they're superficially similar because they've both got sort of recurvy ends, the sayers are actually, that's the kind of levers at the end here, we'll talk about those in a second, are actually substantially different. And of course the entire size of the bow is different. Now obviously I'm dealing with replicas here. This one's from AF Archery incidentally, and this one's from Ali Bow, a new arrival. And they are very, very different recurve bows, very different bows for possibly different purposes. And how does this relate to the English, or let's more widely call it the Western European longbow? Well, the first thing to state before we get into the sort of possible comparisons and also the possible differences is that these were used all over the world at some point. Okay, so everywhere that had bows, admittedly Australia didn't necessarily have bows, but everywhere else that had bows at some point had a form of longbow. So I mentioned, for instance, that the Mughals and various people in India using bows used bows very similar to Turkish bows, and probably inspired by Turkish and Persian bows. But they also had longbows. Now we'll come back to why in a second, and also answer some questions about the longbow in Europe. But the fact is that there were different bows being used in any one place at any one time. And I think a lot of people think that in England, for example, we only had longbows and crossbows, and that's not the case. In fact, recurve bows did exist all over Europe. We see them in art, particularly when we look at Italian Renaissance art, for example, but obviously famously certain people in Central and Eastern Europe, for example the Hungarians, but obviously if you go further east as well, were using forms of recurve bow because of their contact both with the Ottoman Empire in some cases, also with the Mongols, Tatars and various other people. So absolutely recurve bows and longbows were found in Eastern and Central Europe. And we do find, as I mentioned in my previous video, we do even find references in England to Tatar bows in people's wills and inventories. So they existed even in England. So the broader question that I tried to look at before is, why did the longbow remain the primary military bow? And I will come back to that question at the end. But first of all, why were the recurve bows so different to each other? Well, as mentioned, there's a great big diversity of recurve bows, and I certainly don't have the capacity in this video to go through all of them, and I'm not really, honestly, the expert you want to be looking at. Possibly in a future video we'll actually bring on some real experts on the history of recurve bows, because I don't want you to think that I'm sort of, blagging it. But on a basic level, I've taken two extreme examples, or at least something close to an extreme example in this case. So at one extreme example, we have certain Turkish bows of really the post-medieval period. So medieval Turkish bows are probably actually generally slightly larger and heavier than this. But the type of Turkish bow that people are often familiar with really was popular in the sort of 16th to 19th century, and really they reached their most extreme levels in the 18th and 19th centuries. We have records of Turkish ambassadors in London, for example, shooting arrows hundreds of yards, and all of the people who are used to their longbows being astonished at the range of the thing. So range archery, distance archery, even to this day, is often attaining its maximum distances with these very short, very light Turkish bows, in some cases with an overdraw, a kind of slide mechanism. I'll just put that bow down for a second, which enables using a shorter arrow that can come back onto a sort of slide so that you can send a smaller, quicker projectile. Okay, so they're really optimized for distance. Now what you need for distance is speed and a light projectile. So if we look at the people, or the types of bows, the types of people getting the longest ranges out of bows, they are using incredibly quick reflexing, that is from full draw, and you want the longest draw possible. From the furthest longest draw, they're getting back to their rest position as quickly as possible. And for that you need short, recurved, very quick limbs with relatively light limbs. Remember that mass being moved on these limbs is directly proportional to the speed with which, the velocity with which the limbs can get back to the rest point. And that equates to the speed of the arrow coming out of the bow. So you want short, light, very quick bows. However, that's for shooting light arrows a long way. Some of these arrows are so light, if they're made traditionally, they literally break when they hit the ground at the other end, and this is mentioned in historical sources as well. But not everybody wanted to be shooting light arrows a long distance, because do you know what those are really not very good for? Those are not very good for shooting against people in forms of armour. Now bear in mind, of course, between the 16th and the 19th centuries, most people were shedding armour because in the age of gunpowder it wasn't very useful anymore, and ironically that made them more vulnerable to arrows again. But in the age of armour, and this isn't just European armour, I mean obviously this is European burgundy, and obviously this would also apply to European plate armour. There's a sneak peek of my new armour, we'll get to that in a future video coming up. But it could be related to mail, aka chainmail, or lamella, or even gambesons or things like that. So if you're shooting against armies, opponents, enemies who are wearing forms of armour, what you actually don't really want is a very light, fast-moving arrow, because they're not moving fast enough like a bullet that the speed is going to enable them to penetrate armour. What you actually need is a relatively fast-moving, heavier arrow, just like the English warbow arrow. And it just so happens that in medieval China, and indeed Mongolia, and during even later periods with the Manchu bows, and this is a sort of replica of a Ming dynasty bow, somewhat related to Manchu bows, although Manchu bows are even bigger than this. They can be as long as a longbow. This is actually not particularly long, but it's bigger than the Turkish bow. When we actually look at some Manchu bows, they are as long or even longer than some longbows. They can be over 6 foot long. And they are shooting big, heavy arrows. So in both cases, they're shooting at relatively short range very often. We'll come back to that in reference to the longbow in a second. And they're shooting heavy arrows with the express purpose of penetrating armour. So this idea that recurve bows are all about distance and shooting arrows, flight shooting a really long way to rain down arrows on your opponents, in some cases was true for certain types of recurve bow, but it wasn't true for all recurve bows. If we look at many of the Chinese, Mongol, Manchu bows, they are built much bigger, they are longer, they have heavier limbs, they have heavier sayers at the end, and they are built that way to store more energy, to cast heavier arrows at short range with the express purpose of compromising, damaging, sometimes penetrating different types of armoured enemy. So of course that means maybe not in construction or appearance, but in practical use, in warfare use, that actually makes Manchu bows and certain other Chinese bows more similar to the European warbow, which is really about making a heavy-limbed, big bow that can be pushed up to the highest draw weight possible. And bear in mind that some of the Manchu bows or Chinese bows mentioned, for example, during the Boxer Rebellion, up to 150 pounds draw weight, so the same kind of draw weights as European war bows. They're designed to have heavy limbs, store loads of energy, high draw weight. They have to be long to, for the most part, to get up to that draw weight. Shorter bows are under more stress and therefore it's more difficult to make them at very high draw weights, to send a very heavy arrow. And the idea of sending a very heavy arrow is mostly about flat shooting, and you know I've always argued this. Now I wouldn't argue that they were always flat shooting, because we know in some specific examples, Battle of Agincourt being an example, they do shoot at range to try and provoke the enemy to attack. But it does seem that most of the archery, most of the shooting being done actually to wound, is being done at very close range, heavy arrows, flat shooting straight into the target, and probably aiming for gaps and faces when possible. So really, to say that when we're comparing the longbow and the recurve bow, we shouldn't really be comparing, as I have done in the past, to the extreme example, the very light Ottoman recurve bow, which is designed really for distance. The best comparisons actually between the European warbow and Asian bows, for example, are actually with Chinese, Ming Dynasty or Manchu bows, which are longer, heavier, and sending a far more similar type of projectile for the same type of purpose. So hopefully you'll see that this is yet another strong reason why the Europeans, at least most of the Europeans in Western Europe, stuck with longbows instead of recurve bows. There's all other reasons. These are much more complicated to make, but these are fundamentally perfectly good at sending a heavy arrow into an armoured target. They're not good distance bows, but they never needed to be because that wasn't what was required of warfare in Europe, where armour was very prevalent. But one thing I would say in my research is looking at Chinese bows and Manchu bows that I came up with was another really strong reason why possibly these were preferred in certain parts of Europe, and that is durability. So something which comes up time and time again is these recurve bows, as well as being very time consuming and laborious to make, very resource heavy compared to a longbow, they're also quite fragile and easily damaged. The sayers can get twisted at the end. They have horn and sinew on them, which is glued onto wood inside, which is fundamentally vulnerable to weather. Now, an interesting thing I noticed was that in China and other parts of Asia, in fact, for hunting purposes, including India as well, very often they would use simple longbows. And in fact, in some places where recurve bows were absolutely normal in war, for hunting purposes, they often used simple wooden bows, partly because wood, I guess, is cheap and plentiful, but it's also weatherproof, more or less, okay? So if you're out in a rainforest or a typical English or Scottish day, then your chances of getting wet are very, very high. And in those circumstances, having a bow that you really don't have to worry about too much is a virtue. You can just wax the thing if you're that bothered about it, but it'll be more or less fine. I myself have shot longbows for hours in the rain. It's never really been a problem. However, in the modern world, when these bows are made of modern epoxies and with fiberglass and everything else, you don't have to worry. But traditionally, if this was made of the original fish glue, the original sinew and horn that they were using, these are far, far more vulnerable to the elements. And I think the rough campaigning in England and France and northern Germany and Spain and places like this, I think these bows were probably seen as far more serviceable for your standard rank and file archers that you'd raise to go on campaign. Which is a point obviously that I covered in the last video, but I'm starting to think it's even more important than I thought about previously. Anyway, there we go. Just to summarise, when we're comparing European war bows with recurve bows, I think the best recurve bows to look at are actually Chinese and Manchu bows, which in many ways are far more similar to heavy war bows. Similar draw weights, similar weight in the hand, similar stored energy, and shooting a similar projectile for similar purposes. Anyway, I hope that's been useful to some of you. Maybe I'll do a deeper dive into these types of bows, because as I say, I'm not an expert on Asiatic bows at all, but it just so happens I know some people who are, so maybe I'll get them on the channel soon. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and will of course continue to be, and check you're subscribed, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.